I'm Justus Haukap. I'm the director of the Düsseldorf Institute for Competition Economics, and I've also been a member of the German Monopolies Commission for 8 years and also had the pleasure to serve as chairman of the commission for 4 years. And today I'm delighted to give you my thoughts on line of business restrictions as a remedy to competition concerns, which is the topic of the current OECD workshop. What is the problem that we are dealing with? Why are we thinking about line of business restrictions? Well, firms often tend to engage in some degree of self-preferencing. That means they may prefer to purchase inputs from their own subsidiaries, or they may try to convince customers to purchase or use services from their own subsidiaries. That means, if I am a classical example, an electricity company, I may, as a lines company, prefer that my own power plants are connected to my lines, and households are served by my retailer, while I'm maybe less happy with the generation plans of competitors or the retailers or competitors being connected to my lines. So I may self-preference my own subsidiaries. Or, taking the prominent example of Google at the moment, as the Google company, I may be more happy if consumers actually also use not only Google Search but also Google Map, Gmail, YouTube and other services, rather than using other services that are offered by competitors. Typically we would say, well, that's quite natural. Why is there a concern? The concern only emerges if a firm is dominant in a market, or at least has significant market power, and the self-preferencing behavior that we observe is anti-competitive in that it forecloses a market altogether, or at least significantly raises the rivals' costs so that they cannot effectively compete in a market any longer, to the detriment of consumers in the end. The examples of self-preferencing may include outright refusal to supply, something that we have dealt long with, especially with respect to essential inputs to rivals, the denial to grant access to essential facilities to rivals in upstream or downstream markets, or to grant access to these facilities only at conditions that are worse than conditions for self-supply, or to own subsidiaries without any objective justification. That means some sort of discriminatory behavior. Or a more recent phenomenon in digital platforms, that there are biased rankings, for example, that the offer of a non-integrated supplier is demoted or relegated to a place where consumers do actually not read or find it anymore, up to outright misleading information about rival services. So self-preferencing may take actually many forms and detriment consumers in the very end. The problem has been quite prominent in network industries, and here I mean telecommunications, electricity, gas, railway services, and has become quite important when we have been liberalizing and re-regulating these industries in many countries about 20-30 years ago. In so-called network industries, the problem has always been that one operator was controlling the network, the last mile in telecommunications, the electricity transmissions and distribution lines, the gas pipelines, the rail network, and was not willing to give equal access to other operators that needed to use these infrastructures in order to compete in upstream or downstream markets. For example, in electricity generation being an upstream market, or in electricity retailing being a downstream market. And without access to electricity lines, it's obviously not possible to compete in either of the upstream or downstream markets. So in network industries, there have been various degrees of separation in practice. There has been outright ownership unbundling, where the network operator was not allowed to engage at all in either generation or retailing. A weaker form is legal unbundling, where you at least have to set up a different corporate entity. And an even weaker form of separation may be accounting separation, where even within the same legal entity, separate accounts needs to be made. So there are some sort of separations, and the alternative always has been mandated third-party access at somehow regulated prices, where we said, well, why should we separate these companies? Let them do whatever they want, but they need to give access to these infrastructures at regulated prices, so we don't have to go through the troubles of separating them, as long as everybody gets access as the same price. So why not simply regulate the access price? Well, as the experience with network industries has shown, sometimes that works quite well, especially if discrimination takes the form of price discrimination, and you can simply control whether different firms get access at different prices or not. If, however, discrimination takes the forms of non-price discrimination, which may be something like the ranking biases that we talk about these days, or something like discriminatory network investments that we have talked about in the past. For example, that a railway company that also operates the networks is inclined rather to maintain the network where it runs its own trains and not so much where the competitors run the trains, or allocates different slots to different companies that are of different value, then often discrimination may be non-price discrimination, which tends to be much more difficult to control for regulators. So as soon as we move into the world of non-price discrimination, we may think about, well, if regulation becomes too difficult, why not just separate the companies? What are the two main advantages of structural separation, restricting the line of business of the network operator? Well, the incentives to engage in discriminatory behavior are reduced. They don't go away completely. Even a separated network operator, let's say an airport, may still give preference to the largest customer, being one particular airline, for example, but typically the incentives to engage in discrimination are reduced when compared to a fully integrated operator. And the second advantage is that discrimination is easier to detect when it occurs, because once we have separation, we talk about market transactions or observable transactions, at least in the accounts, if we only have accounting separation. So that makes the regulator's life easier and makes it more difficult to discriminate. So the question that pops up next is, of course, why not always mandate structural separation then, if it solves the problem? Well, as always in economics, there's one side and there's the other side. So while it solves some problems, it may bring about new problems. Economies of scope may get lost. There may be benefits of running infrastructure and services at the same time. Especially if we think about digital platforms, it's quite obvious that there are economies of scope in offering different services. So here, once they get lost, we lose real efficiencies in the economy. And second, and at least as important as the economies of scope are investment and innovation incentives, which may be reduced and may get lost for at least 3 reasons. First of all, there's a well-known hold-up problem. If investments are irreversible or, as we say, asset-specific, then the investor may always be concerned that he will not get the fair share of return because there's a strong degree of dependency of the other party in the end. The classical example being the coal mine and the electricity generation plant right next to it, especially with lignite, where they are typically integrated, because otherwise there would be a strong hold-up problem by one of the operators. So here integration may solve problems. Secondly, network operators only have limited impact on pricing, marketing, service quality, etc. of retail services once they are separated. So that means if I, for example, have to roll out broadband but are not allowed to market the broadband that I've rolled out and are not in the charge of the pricing, the service quality that comes along, etc. This also limits the control over how my network is actually used, because I now depend that somebody else is marketing its service so clever that my network is actually used. There may also be the well-known double markup problem that in turn then reduces my investment incentives, because I know if I invest, I'm not in charge anymore of marketing my own investment. And thirdly, investment often require coordination. Think about offshore wind parks and the respective transmission lines. We now have the experience that it's often quite difficult if these are separate companies, that one is later than the other and one may actually give up its investment, and then you are stranded with your respective investment. So here we have an additional reason why integration may actually be beneficial. So that means we don't have an easy answer whether line of business restrictions are a good or bad idea. So what we should do is probably propose a testing scheme for network industries. And here is one. So I have written down 7 questions that one can ask oneself whether line of business restrictions, or put differently, separation, structural separation, is a good idea. Firstly, I would ask, can the facility or the service in question be economically duplicated? If that's the case, then the reasons for separation are not particularly strong. Secondly, we should of course ask, is there sufficient potential for competition in an upstream or downstream market at all? Take, for example, the drinking water industry. Well, we could separate the water treatment from the water source, from the networks. It probably wouldn't make a lot of sense in many cities or regions, because then we have 3 natural monopolies instead of 1 natural monopoly and double markups all over the place. So there's probably not a good reason to separate water networks in many places of the world. Thirdly, can discriminatory behavior be controlled with reasonable means? That means, what's the relevance of price versus non-price discrimination? Taking an example, in electricity, for example, much of the discrimination in the early days took the form of price discrimination. So this is reasonably easy to control for a regulatory authority. While in rail, it often took the form of non-price discrimination, which is much more difficult actually to control. And if you have non-price discrimination, then separation seems to be more beneficial. While with price discrimination, mandated third-party access can do the job by and large. Fourthly, we would ask, are there significant economies of scope lost with structural separation, with line of business restrictions? If so, the separation is not such a good idea, possibly. Fifth, is there a significant risk of a negative impact on investment and innovation if I engage in structural separation? And we should ask at the same time, are there likely positive impacts on innovation investment by rivals, by a service provider, for example, who then get better access to the necessary infrastructures? So asking the investment question here. 6, are there significant transaction costs of separating the relevant assets and services, because it typically costs something? And seventhly, are there consumer preferences for integrated offers, bundles, one-stop shopping, as is arguably the case in internet platforms where consumers might benefit that they can find, going back to the Google example, the information they are searching not only the links to a particular site, but the information directly. So if I look, for example, for a stock price of a given company, consumers may like that they find the information directly on Google or Bing or some other search engine and not only a link to another platform where I can find it, even though that means it's more difficult for the other platforms to compete with this integrated service. So what does it teach us about line of business restrictions for digital platforms? Well, discriminatory behavior is often very difficult to control from outside, because here we don't talk about price discrimination typically. And on top of that, self-preferencing may be based on using consumers' information asymmetries. For example, in the Google shopping case, one of the allegations of the European Commission was that Google demoted or relegated other product comparison sites to the very back of the search list, so that consumers would not find it anymore, but would not even know that they wouldn't find it because they wouldn't know they exist. So this is a particular problem that is very difficult to control for a regulator, so that speaks in favor of separation. But platforms are unlike vertical structures like the old network industries. It's often not quite clear what the core of the monopoly problem is. There is no natural breakup point as we had in telecommunications, electricity, gas, and so on. On top of that, the borders between the businesses or the particular business models change continuously. It is very difficult to draw lines. What have been two separate services yesterday may be an integrated service today. So it's extraordinarily difficult to separate businesses. Thinking just about video, for example, we may think about that hypothetically, wouldn't it be beneficial if Google would be split from YouTube? But then who knows whether information provision in the future isn't much more video based or film based possibly. So shouldn't Google be allowed to offer any films if consumers set the type of information that they want to see? Very difficult question, especially if in such a dynamic industry. Users may like and benefit from integrated offers. They may like that they find the weather information directly on a platform. Economies of scope may be lost, especially in digital markets where the combination of data sets may also provide user benefits, actually. And innovation may be stifled, so clearly not an easy answer, a lot to think about. There are alternative remedies against self-preferencing, a structural separation or structural line of business restrictions become so difficult. Strengthening control of abuse of market power, as currently proposed in Germany's competition law reform, where there are some additional safeguards even if firms are not yet dominant in a market. Protecting and facilitating multi-homing on both sides of a platform, for example, through data portability, interoperability, transparency requirements, which can solve the information asymmetry problem, and third-party access, for example, to data resources at friend conditions. Thank you for your attention. It has been a pleasure.